We just had a fascinating panel with three papers that in many respects are very different, each speaking about different genocides. But I think that in some senses they're linked in a key way. And the common theme that I see moving through these papers poses the question of what do we see when we examine genocide through a non-traditional lens? I think in recent decades, we've seen some of the rich findings that using non-traditional lenses can yield. For example, through a gendered examination of genocide, where we've had a lot of progress that's enabled us to understand the experience of genocide for different groups. I think we've still got far to go in that respect. We often see about the experience of different genders during genocide, but perhaps we haven't yet explored the idea of how females and males differently witness genocide and write about that genocide as witnesses. And that was something that became starkly apparent to me recently when I published an article in Contemporary Armenian Studies exploring the Armenian massacres in the province of Harput, an area that has been very understudied, and in fact that alongside my colleague Ali Sipahi, those were the first two articles exploring this genocide in this province. But by coincidence, I'd mostly used the witness accounts from some female missionaries in the province. So the majority of my evidence was gained from female witnesses to this massacre, whereas Ali had similarly researched witness accounts but used a preponderance of male witnesses. And at one point, as I read through his article, I had to question, are we actually writing about the same massacre? So different were these accounts. What was salient to the women, and perhaps not just what was salient, but what within the constraints of the time they were able to express was very different to what was salient to the men and what they could express. So I think there's still work to go in this area, but that's one example of how a non-traditional lens can add value. Yesterday we were talking about the difference between what we see in sources about genocide and what's reflected in the scholarship. Professor Doris Bergen yesterday was talking about the prevalence of descriptions of sexual violence in the Holocaust in sources, if you look for them, which has not been reflected in the scholarship, including and especially sexual violence against men. Dirk Moses yesterday highlighted that in some Holocaust scholarship, the agency of Jews has been underemphasised to focus on them as innocent victims. That also comes at a cost, though, when we come to think about prevention of genocide. If we focus on victims as passive actors, then we lose our understanding of agency of victims during genocide. And when we apply that to genocide prevention, statistically, we know that agency of the persecuted group is the most likely factor to influence outcome. That is, people who try to save themselves in whatever way they can, regardless of their desperate circumstances, that statistically is how most likely they are to be saved. You know, no one wants to wait for the UN. I think we've established that in the past 70 years. So it comes, the lens that we look at, through which we look at genocide, affects what we see, and that can come at a cost. When I approach archives, I'm also always struck by the local displacement during massacres, the local flight as people run from one house to another, one tree to hide behind to another, to behind the bathhouse, to up on someone's roof, the sheer physicality and exhaustion of massacre day in, day out as people struggle to survive while those struggle to kill them. And that's something that I've always felt comes through much less in the scholarship than in the sources. Professor Gerlach today has explored this non-traditional lens admirably through the theme of the sounds of genocide, and helps us ask the questions of, well, how can we get closer to those sounds? What do they tell us, and how do they add value to our understanding? And equally importantly, what is the significance of sounds that are not there? What can we hear through the silence? Professor Strauss made an argument also with a non-traditional lens, arguing that there's not enough on the violence surrounding the Rwandan genocide rather than perhaps the violence during the Rwandan genocide, and suggesting that we widen our focus both temporally and geographically. In his written paper, he's argued, somewhat controversially, that some of the subsequent retributive violence might itself be considered genocide. Yet I'm going to pose another non-traditional lens through which to consider that retributive violence. And perhaps we might think about that through the framework of revenge. Revenge, or we might prefer to conceptualise it as extra-legal attempts to seek justice, is another theme that appears far more commonly in the archives than in the scholarship. Just a couple of years ago, I was looking at final testimonies of Holocaust victims before they were subsequently killed, last diary entries, notes left behind, so on and so forth. And I was really struck by the strong expression of desires for revenge in what was very often people's last words. So I'll give you a quote, for example, of some testimony from a notebook written by prisoners in Chelmno, who were subsequently killed. And one wrote, "The day of September 1st, the day when they burnt our families, we shall remember all our lives. The same fate awaits us. But we live in hope that God will let us stay alive until the moment when we shall be able to revenge the revenge of all our beloved souls, torn off our hearts. We ask any man to revenge, because in the meantime, we cannot do anything." Or another prisoner, Berek Satenfield, who at the end of his final note wrote, "I'm finished to write, and I ask all free human beings and from the armies who enter this region to revenge for the truth which I hereby told, and revenge the blood of all the innocent people who were so brutally murdered, because I myself cannot do anything, and God shall reward you." We can also see this framework in things like the Israeli capture of Eichmann in Argentina, or Operation Nemesis after the Armenian genocide, whereby the Armenian community sought to make the leading perpetrators pay with their lives for what they had done. In all of these cases, though, the victims could do very little. They were, by and large, incredibly powerless. But if we place this in the context of Rwanda, we have a very rare outcome at the end of a genocide where the victim group or its representatives actually attain power. And so therefore I ask, is it this power what led to this larger magnitude of retributive killing after the genocide? Is it a function that they, perhaps more than any other victim group in the 20th century, had the capacity to express their anger, if you will, in this way. Professor Strauss has also problematized the category of genocide. And there's been quite a discussion in the last couple of days of his alternative category of mass categorical violence. We have many terms that we've used to talk about this kind of violence. At the time of the Armenian genocide, there was no term genocide, of course, so it was extermination. Time of the Cambodian genocide, auto-genocide was a term that people used for some time, but one that's faded. We can think about terms like democide, politicide, ethnic cleansing, mass atrocities, R2P crimes. And of course, each has its costs and benefits. But perhaps a challenge here, as Professor Suni pointed out this morning, is that when you put too much together, one of the compromises can be explanatory power. And I think we must recognise that we're here today to talk about genocide, not one of these other terms, perhaps because genocide is the term with the legal definition, with the legal weighting and the legal implications as a legal concept. So as we problematise this term, we must also ask that does the value of using an alternative term outweigh the benefits that come with the legal definition of genocide? Finally, let me turn to Professor Cribb's paper on emotions. And this is also a non-traditional lens, and perhaps a doubly challenging one, in the sense that emotions can be underemphasised both in sources as well as scholarship. Although if I think back to my Harput paper that I spoke about earlier, perhaps less so in sources written by females, where emotion, I think, often does figure more prominently. Instinctively, we know the importance of emotion in this field. As teachers, as scholars, we know many of our most powerful sources, like Art Spiegelman's Mouse or Elie Wiesel's Night, are most powerful precisely because they are gut-wrenchingly emotional. Professor Cribb identified 3 emotions associated with the sudden outbreak of genocide: a sense of urgency, a sense of indignation, and a sense of resolve. But I'm going to challenge Professor Cribb by suggesting that I think missing from that list is a perception of threat. The perception of existential threat, many people have written about this, myself, Maureen Hibbert, for example, the perception of existential threat as both justifying an impetus for the onset of genocide. I'm also going to problematise Professor Cribb's notion of political emotions and ask, are they emotions felt by political leaders? Are they emotions expressed by political leaders? Or are they the emotions that political leaders wish to evoke in the societies on which they're about to unleash genocide? But enough from me. I'm now going to invite your questions on this concept of what is revealed, or perhaps what is occluded, when we view genocide through a non-traditional lens, as each of our speakers have today. Are there any questions? Thank you. I think we'll take them in groups of 3. We've just got the microphone, 1, 2, 3. There we go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentations. I really appreciate the non-traditional approach on genocide to highlight the perspective of those who are victims and perpetrators, in the sense of how they feel and how we can understand that as part of the history of genocide. So one of my questions will be to Scott. Is it the problem of the genocide term that it was mostly problematic for Rwanda, or is it the reconciliation framework itself? I mean, what exactly is, because it seems to me that it's the way in which we conceive of reconciliation, perhaps the role of reconciliation in this context of Rwanda. And again, I'm not very, my knowledge is not obviously as yours, but it seems to me that there is that discussion that I'd like to hear from you. Also, perhaps rethinking about the unspoken or unheard genocides or crimes that you were describing, is it not also related to the colonial aspect and the fact of how much perhaps the role of colonial powers in the context of Rwanda, but also in the context of what could be highlighted and what couldn't? And I think generally in the recognition of genocide, these kind of things play a role, like what we can speak about internationally and what we cannot. So how much of it was related to colonialism? And in this sense, like we've been talking a little bit about colonialism in these panels, but not perhaps as much. It was raised a little bit by Michelle earlier, but it seems to me that it has an impact in silencing a lot of the crimes due to perhaps also colonial participation or organization, etc. So thank you so much.
Scott, I totally agree in your doubting the usefulness of a genocide frame. One issue here is that one sort of episode of mass violence cancels out the other. For example, Burundi in 1972, US State Department pretty much concluded it was a case of genocide. The British kind of posed it as a question. Well, then came 1994, no one spoke about Burundi anymore. Another thing, of course, are the RPF crimes. Just last week, Philippe Rentiens, who is no friend of Kagame government, came on Al Jazeera and spoke about the downing of the plane. 25 years later, we still don't know what happened due to the obstruction of Rwandan government, quo bono. He was saying, well, I mean, the missiles that they used was of Ugandan provenance. I mean, who could possibly use it? I mean, Romeo Dallaire in his autobiography spoke very openly about the RPF crime. I remember one episode when they were shelling the church with the civilians in. And of course, this discourse applies not only to Rwanda. Another classical case would be Sudan, for example. I mean, civil war that lasted for 50 years. I encountered references, it was referred as genocide, and then came Darfur in 2005, and then something unusual happened. Year after year, it was referred to as an ongoing case of genocide. I tried to probe my colleagues. I said, well, is it still ongoing? And they kind of shied away from answering me that. And then, of course, you remember the South Sudan came into existence, and George Clooney announced he has some funds to monitor it from space, that genocide won't happen. Well, it didn't happen. But what happened now, horrible civil war. Are the celebrities still monitoring from space? No, they don't. When was the last time you heard about Darfur? You didn't. Was any resolution to the conflict? No. Violence still occasionally flares up in Darfur. There is a huge displacement camp that's still there after 13 years. So is it useful, this genocide frame? No. In my profession, I just call it decontextualization. Thank you.
Scott, we already talked a little bit about this, but I just want to continue the conversation a little bit. The Bosnian case is shares just a lot of characteristics of the Rwandan case, and I really have two questions for you. First of all, what do you think about the courts? In other words, on balance, we have the ICTY and the ICTR, and in both of them have been heavily criticized by scholars and kind of post-conflict resolution people as not having done their job, and maybe it would have been better without them. Do you think it would have been better without them? You wrote a great book on the Rwandan genocide, The Order of Genocide. Anybody who hasn't read it should read it. What would you say now? Would you do things differently? I mean, you made a great contribution to genocide studies and to understanding what was going on in Rwanda. Are you saying now, in some ways, you'd prefer not to have written that book? I'd be curious. And Robert, you wouldn't have gotten tenure. But and Robert, I just we started this conversation too. But I'm interested in the emotions, related a little bit to what Christian's doing. Emotions of the perpetrators in the field. Now, those people who are actually doing the killing, I mean, clearly they are not involved maybe some indignation and sense of urgency and resolve, but is that what's driving the people around the country and in the areas where they're killing people in Aceh and other places? You know, what kind of emotions drive the people who are killing? That would be the question.
Okay, so I have a couple questions to me, and I want to just clarify something that came up in Siobhan's comments Siobhan's comments and Anton's and a little bit in Deborah's. I stick to the use of the term genocide. I think there is a phenomenon in the world which is a logic of violence to destroy groups. At the same time, I think we have to think about embedding that type of violence in a broader spectrum of violence. And so I introduce, and not in this paper, but in a book I published a couple years ago, the term mass categorical violence, of which I think genocide is a subset. So I want to be clear, first of all, I'm not proposing to reject genocide or to an alternative framework. I am proposing a way of embedding the phenomenon of genocidal violence within a broader category of violence. I want to just be kind of clear on that. So what I was doing in this paper is saying not that we shouldn't call what happened in Rwanda genocide, but we have to take responsibility for the consequences of having done that. And in my view, one of the consequences of having done that is to overshadow or render invisible other kinds of mass violence against civilians that occurred in that country at the same time. So it's not, and maybe this is where we might disagree, I still think I want to protect a space empirically to call things genocide. I just also think we have to think about broader categories of violence and not create a hierarchy. I mean, this is to Dirk's point, or to be really careful about hierarchies of violence, because, you know, hundreds of thousands of people dying, whether it's from genocide or from crimes against humanity, still hundreds of thousands of people dying. So I wanted just to kind of be clear. I want to just take this opportunity, I want to do it quickly, but I want to be clear about some things that Deborah said that I attributed to me that I didn't feel that I was saying. Number one, I don't think it was retributive violence in Congo. First of all, I don't think we know. I think this was destructive violence. The RPF made a calculation that those Hutu refugees that did not come back to Congo were permanently against an RPF or Tutsi-led state, and therefore that they represent a long-standing threat and that they should be eliminated. This was not revenge violence, in my view. And second, the reason why this matters is that there is and I'm sorry to get kind of Rwanda on you, but when the genocide happened in Rwanda, France articulated an argument that there was a double genocide in Rwanda. And that's not what I'm saying. Okay, I want to be really clear, because this is super political and super sensitive in this region of the world. I'm saying that in Rwanda, the RPF, as they went down and took over the country and as they consolidated power, killed tens of thousands of Hutu civilians. I'm not sure that was retributive violence. Maybe some of it was. But they did that to consolidate power. Then, 2 years later, they invaded Congo. And there, they killed hundreds of thousands of Hutu civilians. And that, I think, there's a good argument for calling that violence genocide, and that's what the UN concluded before they had to walk it back because of diplomatic pressure from Rwanda. And that's different from a double genocide thesis. I just want to be really clear, because this stuff gets very polemical very quickly. I don't think there are any Rwandans in the room. I could be wrong, but you know, if we were to be somewhere else, I just want to be clear what I'm saying, what I'm not saying, or someone's recording this and is going to accuse me of being a denialist or whatever, which happens. So, second, I want to be careful about lauding revenge. I mean, human rights, I see genocide as part of a human rights history, and I don't think we want to be in the business of saying, you know, extrajudicial killing is something that we want to support. I mean, whether or not this, maybe legal, maybe you can be critical, and I'll get to the legal point about the problems of legality and criminal processes and justice. But I want to be really careful that I don't want to be associated with saying revenge, extrajudicial killing is a rational and okay response to genocidal violence. Okay. The term, is the problem genocide, the genocide term, or is it reconciliation? So what I think has happened with it's about the fact that it's an exclusive focus on genocide in Rwanda. What that has done is it allowed certain victims to be able to narrate their story and talk about the suffering and trauma and victimization that they have experienced, or that the consequences of that violence. And others are not able to say that same thing, even if their families have, even if they have experienced sexual violence, even if their members of their family have been killed, even if they have been displaced or whatever. And that, I think, in terms of reconciliation, is a problem. There is a blockage on a set of violence, and you cannot talk about it. You cannot talk about it publicly in Rwanda. So that's sort of, I think, where I was going now. But the genocide term, I think what I'm trying to get at is the theme of the conference, the problems of the term is that it's so powerful as a concept that it can reinforce this idea that there is one set of victims and perpetrators and not another one. And so that's how I think these things are related. Okay, the courts on balance. This is a big question. I think, let's think about how I want to answer this. There's the pre-Trump answer and there's the post-Trump answer, okay? And I think that as scholars in this field, many people have developed, including myself, a kind of critical human rights approach, which is to say, there was a liberal interventionist approach that really emphasized, these justice processes as a mechanism of reconciliation, deterrence, and so forth. And I think people who made that argument oversold it, and it promised more than it could deliver in terms of history, in terms of deterrence, in terms of reconciliation, and stirred up a lot of issues. Certainly, I think the Yugoslav case, that documentation. Former Yugoslavia, that documentation is a little bit stronger than in Rwanda. And I think the ICC has been filled with inefficiencies. Okay, and there's been inefficiencies, and there's been corruption, and these things have taken forever, and they're remote. But on balance, I'm glad they exist. I just want to, I want to be clear, and that's the pre-Trump, post-Trump. I mean, I don't want to tear it down. I just think we need to acknowledge what some of the problems have been with these justice mechanisms. So I think, but I do think in the Rwanda case, and this is not as true, I think, in the Yugoslav case, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, I do think the fact that the RPF was able to block any accountability, any trials of RPF crimes has meant that that court has essentially produced a one-sided view of the history of violence. And as an instrument of reconciliation, I think that it remains very limited. Am I glad it exists? Yes. We learned a lot from that court, and there's a lot of documentation, and I'm glad that it exists. I just wish they had been able to, prosecute on the other side. I think that was their responsibility, and they failed. And I think saying that is not equivalent to saying to tear it down. So would I do the book now? I would. I think I would maybe, it's in the book, but I would have said a little more clearly, there were other kinds of violence. I say it, but I wish I would have foregrounded it, and I can't study those. This is what I can study. I think it's important to study. I think we should think about it in a comparative context, but let's not forget.
So on the question of the broad question of using this approach of emotions, so I was drawn to it by the fact that I felt uncomfortable with the way that people would mention emotions as a kind of black box. something that could be used to explain things that didn't fit into conventional political science, historical analysis. And it seemed to me that it was really important to open that black box and see what we could find there. Was there anything that could be done with it? Now, I'm really conscious that there's two, at least at the moment, with my limitations, there's two big problems. One is that we lack an agreed vocabulary about what emotions are. We were having our conversation and we were struggling to come up with the right word for a particular kind of emotion. There's an emotion which we call Schadenfreude, which now everyone is familiar with. It came into English in the 19th century, but we can actually find people writing in English in the 18th century who more or less say, hey, you know that feeling that you have when you feel quite happy about a misfortune that falls on someone else? We give it a name now, Schadenfreude. So that example suggests to me that we have some areas of common agreement. And if we work hard on the question of emotions, we may actually be able to develop within some limits an agreed set of terms or agreement about terms. The other big problem is that emotions are volatile. So the emotions that I go through immediately before, during, and after giving a presentation are familiar, but they're very difficult to pinpoint. It's very difficult to ask someone, how did you feel at that particular moment? They don't have the vocabulary, they don't necessarily remember reliably. So whereas interests and beliefs are often recorded, and they're often there's a much more fixed vocabulary for them, emotions are so volatile that it's very difficult to pin them down. Those are both really serious problems in getting the analytical, in making the most of the analytical potential of using emotions. So when we try to work out what emotions the actual killers felt, we're using hints in the way they remember how they felt. We're using hints in the way the victims or the witnesses report seeing them. And we're being speculative. We're trying to imagine what is the emotion that we recognize that fits best with this evidence. Now that's much less satisfactory than other kinds of analysis. But on the other hand, if we don't do it, then we've got that black box, and that's a big problem. The issue that Deborah raised of who was it? Deborah? No, Deborah raised it, of the role of political leaders in evoking emotions is a really important one. I described emotions as things from a repertoire which are chosen by the individual in a social context. I think we have to recognize how important emotions are in our social interactions. Probably all of you have done this kind of public speaking. You see people in the audience smiling and nodding. One of them's doing that at this very moment. It's very cheering for me. You see people in the audience frowning, looking disconcerted. There's someone doing that at the moment too. That's much more disconcerting. So emotions are a hugely important part of the way we construct our immediate social environment. But of course we can't be blind to the fact that emotions are also being manipulated by people in power. And sorting out the social dimension and the political dimension is another really difficult task. It's a second order task, but it's a really difficult task. So the question of whether people felt, or how important it was that people felt threatened versus how important it was that they felt indignant about the Communist Party. There is, in part, I use the term urgency, which embodies part of the idea of threat. It's urgency because the country is making a choice. We're going to go this way or that way. So one way is a threat, one way is a promise. But of course we understand it differently if we use the term threat as opposed to using the term urgency. That's part of what I mean about this problem of vocabulary. We have many terms, the terms overlap. We don't quite agree on what they mean. But it feels to me that academically and intellectually, we're at the beginning of exploring a really important topic, and it would be a mistake to abandon it just because it looks very difficult.
Yeah, I have something. Sorry, just in response to what you said. Yeah, first of all, and I tried to do that in the talk and paper briefly, it is also important to pay attention to sounds missing or sorts of sounds missing, but I would say that is something else than looking for silence. So, because people mention sometimes silence explicitly, there was silence. Nothing could be heard. That's something different. Female versus male experience, well, overall I would say I saw variation, but I didn't see huge differences between male and female statements. And this goes to Chaknaga, and for example, also for the persecution of Jews and in the anti-partisan warfare, like the one based on 200 statements, the other on 160. There were some differences, like it's on the margins in the notes of that article, but not so much different. Interesting is especially this difference when it comes to crying. But in both cases, like if you go to Chaknaga, also of the persecution of the Jews, you also have men crying. Men crying, including men crying collectively in public. Yeah, so I didn't see clear tendencies that like of differentiation. But for crying there are some, but they are also not so clear as one could expect. And then crying, let me come back to the emotions. There is a history of crying, and there's a scholarship on crying from other disciplines. The scholarship says that it is nearly impossible to tell the causes for somebody crying. I used an example with students, like we were watching a movie that was from the funeral procession, like on vehicles through Pyongyang when Kim Il-sung had died. And the people were crying. And also the reporter on the TV was, and why were they crying? Out of fear? Fear because the repressive political system, out of fear because their leader of all lifetime had died, and where will things go? Where's our guidance? Because you cry when somebody died? Because of a local tradition? Like, was it social, political this way, political that way? Out of, what emotions are involved? Very, very difficult to say. And almost impossible to clearly isolate factors because there are strong social traditions and cultural traditions of crying. And this was clearly visible to come to the issue of visibility. Thousands cried along the roads. They threw themselves down to the ground sometimes and so on. And yet you couldn't say what the emotions were. And one more thing. You, in your comment, repeatedly said things like, and actually I now also, what do we see? What is our lens? And so on. In scholarship, we are used to metaphors of visibility. In the one article in the field that I already published, I suggested to include the term un-perspective. I want to offer an un-perspective because perspective has spectare in it. Watch. It was censored. So you can't use that. Use another term. But the thing is that one needs to be careful if one wants to do sound history, not to fall back too much into these metaphors of vision.
Spoken like a true sound historian. Let's do another round of questions. I know Robert wants to say something as well, but let's do another round of questions. 1, 2, and 3.
Yes, I have a question for Robert first and then one for Scott. For Robert, because you started saying that you went into this, if I'm not mistaken, because you were, first of all, because this was this switch from the big role of the civilians to the role of the military in organizing this. And then you switched to the role of emotions in order to understand how this exploded all of a sudden. And then you seem to describe, not perfectly, I read something, but I'm not, of course, a specialist in this. You describe crowds of civilians killing, having emotions about killings. Where are the military? Since you said, are these civilians instigated by military? That is, since you spoke of this, and then you use this category, it seems to revert to the civilians that are not amok, but still, emotionally laden and going out to kill. And so it looks like a contradiction to me, maybe because I don't see. To Scott, to ask a question is more difficult because I agreed so much that it's difficult to. No, of course I have a question. The question is, because it seems to me, and that's why we call this the power and problems, not just the problems, also the power of a category. And you did many things. One thing was to show the problems and the power created by the ethical content of the category. That once you have, that you moralize history in a way with this, and by moralizing, as always it happens, you crystallize things in a way that do not lead to further evolution. Is this what you had in mind? And second, is this only about Rwanda, or there are other cases in Africa where you can see this dynamic in which they use the moralistic, let's say, approach that is one of the strengths, of course, of the category. On the long run, creates problems. This is my question.
Thank you. Thank you for the great papers. First, about emotions. What I really appreciated in your paper is the specificity that you gave to particular emotions as explanations. Because when I was trying to do work on the emotions in the Armenian genocide, a very smart political scientist, David Layton, who can be cruel sometimes, said to me, but Ron, emotions are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. So you're going to explain things by oxygen or something like that? You need to be specific. So I thought that was really good. But here's my question. We know from the literature on emotions that there are things like emotional regimes, or what you called emotional repertoires. That is, universes of available emotions expressed in certain ways in different cultures at different historical periods. We know that emotion and cognition, rationality, are not mutually exclusive, despite the Western discourse that one is female and one is masculine and we're the rational ones, that they're connected. And we know that there's a whole realm of, you can call it in a big sense, affect, in which there are emotions, which you talked about as fleeting and volatile, etc. But there are also things which I've tried to emphasize that are called moods, like tiredness, but I'm not worried about that, but what I call dispositions, proclivities towards certain kinds of emotions or understandings or social constructions than others. So my question is twofold. One, what are the regimes or the repertoires? What are the dispositions you find? Things that you might not find that you find in Indonesia. And then secondly, there are two powerful emotions that I found in my genocide, so to speak. One is fear. That is, fear is an emotion of things that of which there's a real object, a lion is running toward you or something. And then there's anxiety. And I thought I heard in your presentation anxiety. That is fear without an object. Fear of an unpredictable but anticipated possible future. What do you think of that?
Sure.
Anton, I don't want to steal the mic from you, but it's due course, due order. I have a question for Christian. Now that you have become a sound historian, I was wondering where you're going to take it, and I'm glad you started from a textual basis or from exploring sound of a massacre that is actually in a far distant. But will you also, or have you started thinking about current sounds of current genocides that are being recorded, and how are you going to tackle with YouTube videos? Or we discussed the audio recording of the beheading of Khashoggi in the Saudi embassy. But I think videos are particularly interesting because you sometimes hear much more than you actually see. And so where do you see the opportunities and where do you see the risks of current sounds? Thank you, or recorded sounds.
Okay, we'll take one more and then we'll go.
Just a brief comment or the example that Christian gave about, why people of North Korea were crying when the great leader died. And I don't think there's much mystery there. Well, it's mass psychosis plus complicity. I mean, it's the same phenomenon that everyone clapped when Stalin was talking, everyone's afraid to stop first. When everyone cried in 1953, including my grandmother, millions of Russians, there is no tradition of crying in Russia. When Brezhnev died, Ustinov and Andropov in 1980s, no one cried.
Okay. Where will sound history take me? Not to recordings. The audio recording of this apparent murder in the Saudi embassy is a good example. I see problems of source criticism. That is also that we didn't discuss in regard to emotions, including self-descriptions of what were my emotions there and then, including in diaries on the same day. But I stick to the texts. I'm one of those, Annette talked about those old German historians with their written tradition. There you are. And by the way, I also try to acquire belly because you don't trust a bold hairdresser and you don't trust a German professor without a belly. Anton, about Pyongyang. No. I think that's a very simple thought. And one could continue. For example, actually, I disagree with the pictures that I saw of Stalin's funeral. Few people crying, people very composed, totally unlike when there was this procession in Pyongyang. One can then go further on when the next in line had died, Kim Jong-il. Then there was also much crying, but people usually did not throw themselves on the ground anymore. The speaker behaved differently, and also The crying was less pronounced, the emotionality. There were still people in uniform, officers in uniform crying, but it was somehow less pronounced. So there was also a ranking. Yeah. And also, there's a film about when Chu En-lai was put to the grave, like that procession. A lot of crying there also. So maybe there is regional traditions coming into it too, aside from, of course, strong traditions of religious culture in communist systems. So no, I don't think it's easy at all.
A comment to make on sound and the gender dimension. I know from my home experience that there is a significant difference in the acuity of hearing between males and females. So you would expect that women would report hearing more than men of the same age, and that there would be a difference across the ages as well. And I think going to the next point, which is partly the Kim Il-sung issue, there's a bit of a tendency to think that because we share emotions, that we can interpret emotions equally well across cultures and across historical circumstances. I'm quite often conscious when I'm refereeing manuscripts and things like that of people who make judgments about, poorly thought through judgments about the significance of emotional expressions. Seems to me that emotion takes just as much, perhaps more research than looking at political ideology or looking at interests. And this is what you ended up saying, but it wasn't what you were suggesting at the beginning. Andrea's question about the military. Yes, you really did catch me out. And the reason is that I was, for a long time, one of those scholars who focused especially on the masses. And I have been dragged, initially unwillingly, but now enthusiastically, to recognizing that it was the military who played the pivotal role. Nonetheless, civilians played a significant role in carrying out the work of the military, and understanding why they did that, what they felt while they were doing it, I think is still important. And there were some regions, particularly East Java, which was one of the really important regions for the killings, where the role of the military was relatively minor. So there we truly are dealing with civilians. Even with soldiers, it becomes an issue. And it becomes an issue specifically in the Indonesian case, because the Indonesian army took shape as a people's army. It took shape as an army for which close engagement with the people was a matter of principle and belief. And yet this army turned around and massacred hundreds of thousands of its own citizens. So understanding just what emotional state was necessary for soldiers to do that, I think is important. So you were right to catch me out on that, but I think the issue of what the civilians were doing is perhaps a little bit more accessible than the issue of what the military were thinking. Ron's question, what were the dispositions? That's a really good question, and I have to think about that. I don't have a good answer. In saying that you sensed anxiety, you highlight that question of vocabulary. Just what terms do we use to describe these phenomena? We've clearly got threat, we've got anxiety, we've got urgency. Just what is the best term? What results do we get if we switch terms? I think it's really important. It reflects the preliminary nature of the field, I'm afraid.
Great. Just quickly on the emotions, I just want to say that there's also a lot of new research on perpetrators, and I think Tom is back there, and there's a new journal, a couple new books, and so I think some of these questions are being fleshed out as well. So I just wanted to flag that. So Andrea's question, which is a really fascinating question, which is the problem with genocide that it moralizes history? And I do think that genocide is an ethical concept, and implies it's almost always a moralistic concept, and which I think presents challenges for scholarship, because I don't think we're necessarily engaged primarily in moral reasoning, at least the non-philosophers. But that's not the problem that I think I've observed in Rwanda. I mean, I do think that that's there. For me, what I think I was trying to draw attention to is the way in which it has eclipsed, it has overshadowed, I keep using that word, other forms of violence. It's come to define history. It's a political use, but I think the reason why I drew attention to us is that I think we frame that period of time as the Rwandan genocide. That's what we call that period of violence. And there was genocide in Rwanda, but there was also other kinds of violence. And so I think for me, it's maybe it's the power, emotive power, maybe all of those things, the moral, the legal, political power, all wrapped up into one, which I think has overshadowed seeing other forms of violence that were roughly contemporaneous at that period of time. I think that for me is the concern. Look, we know, to your question about other cases in Africa, that victim groups often want to, they insist on narrating their experience as genocide. It's part of the recognition that, part of the recognition they seek for the suffering they've experienced. And it can be, in a contemporary case, a way of triggering international responses. So right now in Cameroon, right, where I would say, to answer your question, in Cameroon or in Senegal or parts of Ethiopia, you have insurgencies, and the state has cracked down very violently. And I think these are places that are at risk of genocide, but what you see are the spokesmen for these insurgencies saying that they have experienced genocide. And I think that's an obstacle. I don't think that's true empirically, and it has created an obstacle to trying to come up with some type of resolution to the conflict. And I think, to go back to Anton's point, I think you can see that in Sudan sometimes, where genocide, I think, invites a kind of absolutist response, which gets back to your moral question of there's a good and there's a bad, and can often, I think, be an obstacle to conflict resolution in ongoing cases. So that's it. It's hard. I mean, I'm not, anyway, that's my response. Yeah.
Okay, just two more things. We haven't yet quite noticed this tendency that you expect that women will report more about sounds than others. But we look into it, also into the question of age, region, and so on in the big project on persecution of Jews. And I was too short in the answer to Alexander. That's one of the reasons why I don't do research through recordings, is that it would be a very small sample. I try to have big sample, many people, and then try to see big tendencies. And I also don't do interviews and ask people how did it sound, because one of the things that occurred to me is that most people don't reflect upon the sounds that they mention in their narratives. So it's a kind of unconscious mentioning, kind of a hidden layer, even perhaps for the persons who did the account.
Please join me in thanking our panel this afternoon. And there's coffee out in the foyer.
But just short it down. From this, you will be leaving in various waves from us.
I should let you know that the Toronto Marathon is on tomorrow. So understand that you had better time yourselves well to give yourself enough time to do it. Can you hear? Yeah, okay. That if you take the train from Union Station, it's the safest way to get out to the airport because they run along the lakeshore. So ask at the hotel and find out if you need any how much extra time you will need. For most of the participants so far, most of you will be leaving tomorrow, I understand. Do not think we will finish with tomorrow. We will be having tomorrow morning a meeting with our early career scholars, hearing some of the themes they are interested in, looking forward to their feedback about what we've done, giving them a little more information on what we do with the Holodomor. I might say that our conference is now going through transformations. So we will have coffee, then we will have our discussion. Then you will have coffee again, and then we will be in the midst of the 21st annual Ukrainian Famine lecture. Toronto has the longest going annual lecture on the Ukrainian famine. This usually is a quite large event for the Ukrainian community where we have 200, 250 people who come yearly to this event. But tomorrow in the afternoon, they are unveiling the Toronto Holodomor monument. The oldest Holodomor monument is in Edmonton, and in fact was put up, the sculptor is the sister of Mr. Temerte, who is the funder of our conference. There is, if you have not seen it, a quite spectacular Holodomor monument in Washington, D.C. So when you are there, please go out to see that. But that means there'll be a massive community event tomorrow out there. We will be joined for the 21st Famine lecture that Dr. Hranevich will be giving by those members of the community we could fit into this group. So we will have shifted to a half community event and be looking forward to our famine lecture. I might add, we have got extra copies of the Holodomor Reader. The co-editor of the Reader is Dr. Bogdan Klid, who will be the chair of our last session. For those of you who have not picked up one, would like to pick up one at that point, please do so. It also was a symbol to many of us when it was put out five years ago, I would guess, the development of Holodomor studies. From the point of the 1970s when professors of the University of Toronto refused to let students write papers on the famine in Ukraine, to the 1980s when Robert's Conquest book came out, and we understand, and I've written on the very varied reaction to that book. It has been a long process by which the field developed, and then of course when you can get a reader, you know you've got good material on that. Other announcements at this point? No. Okay, and Martha will inform me of other announcements to make. But you're a good group. You'll go along with us on all these transformations, and I'm sure the rest of the time, for us will be an honor to have you. The lecture will be in this room, and that is why we had to limit the number of people we could let come in to join us. And the reception is same place as last time, and this time it's Ukrainian food. So we switch once more in multicultural Toronto. We walk to the other place after the lecture, after the Holodomor lecture. You are all in for the lecture for Dr. Hranevich, and then afterwards we all go over to the other place.